Good afternoon, and welcome to another Manhattan Institute eventcast brought to you by our Policing and Public Safety Initiative. I'm Charles Fain Lehman, fellow at the Institute, and I'm delighted to be moderating today's panel, Asian Americans Under Attack. A wave of violence has plagued Asian American communities across the country in recent months, including the murder of 8 people, 6 of them Asian Americans, at massage parlors in Atlanta. Other locales, from New York City to Oakland, California, have seen a spike in assaults and robberies of Asian American residents, prompting outrage and a nationwide conversation about anti-Asian bias. Just on Monday, a woman was assaulted just blocks away from Times Square in broad daylight, a sign that the problem is not going away. Public commentators have struggled to pin down the causes of this crime wave, fixating on white supremacy and former President Donald Trump, while paying little attention to the details on the ground. What is really causing the increase in attacks? And more importantly, what can we do to stop them? To answer these questions and more, we brought together a panel of experts who are close to the issues at hand. Before I introduce our panel, I'd like to remind everyone to please send us your questions through the comment function of whatever platform you're watching us on, and I will do my best to get to as many as I can during the discussion. And now I'm excited to introduce our panel. Carl Chan is the president of the Oakland Chinatown Chamber of Commerce and a leader in the Neighborhood Crime Prevention Council. He's also the director of Claremont Development, an East Bay real estate company. Lately, he has garnered national attention for his efforts to respond to the increasing crimes against Asian Americans in Oakland. Ravi Satkalmi is the deputy director of intelligence analysis for the New York City Police Department's Intelligence Bureau, where he oversees teams investigating threats from terrorism as well as from racially and ethnically motivated extremism. Wesley Yang is an esteemed essayist and current columnist at Tablet. He is also author of the New York Times notable book, The Souls of Yellow Folk, and is a National Magazine Award winner. Gentlemen, I think I'm going to start with Ravi. Ravi, what can you tell us about how NYPD officers are thinking about and understanding what's happening in Asian American communities in New York City? How does this recent spike compare to the past several years' worth of hate crimes and overall crime trends?
Yeah, thanks, Charles. And first of all, I just want to say thank you for extending the invite to me. This is obviously a very topical issue and something that we're spending a lot of time thinking about here at the police department. And I think, to kind of get a better understanding of how we're thinking about it, I think we need to take a step back a little bit and put this into some context, right? So when we're talking about anti-Asian hate crimes, we're talking about basically a continued rise of hate crimes that we have seen across this country for a past few years, right? So this is this trend of hate crime specifically isn't necessarily new, but the target set is a little different. So to put some numbers on that, for example, in 2019, pre-COVID, right before we flipped into 2020, that year ended with about a 20% increase in hate crimes over 2018. And 2019 was a record year for hate crimes in New York City specifically. It was a record year for anti-Semitic attacks in 2019. It was also a high watermark for anti-LGBTQ attacks as well. And that was kind of the momentum that we were looking at going into 2020 before the COVID shutdowns really came into place and really turned everything on their heads. But going through 2020. There are definitely like ebbs and flows of criminality across the city that we witnessed in the weeks immediately following the lockdown. We saw a precipitous decline in crime, but then that started to tick up towards the end of the year. But overall, at the end of 2020, we had gotten to a place where overall crime in the city was broadly down slightly, although there are some notable exceptions when we talk about homicides and we talk about shootings. And also a decrease of about 40% in hate crimes across the board, right? So you look at those numbers and you think about, all right, we've had a general decrease in criminal activity. We've had a decrease in, broadly speaking, hate crimes, but we did still see an increase in anti-Asian specific hate crimes, right? So we went from the official figures for the PD were like 3 in 2019 to just under 30 in 2020, which is almost a tenfold increase, and a notable one at that. And it was a little bit of a microcosm of what we were seeing nationally. I think you cited those figures earlier, at least in your piece, about how the national figures look like 150% increase in anti-Asian hate crimes, and so we're seeing some of that here. Here in New York, to date this year, we're looking at about 33. The incident that you mentioned on Monday was particularly horrific. If you saw that video, I think you're probably at a loss for words to describe what happened there. But that same day, we had somebody assaulted on a subway that we're also investigating as a potential hate crime. And those are the kinds of things that we've been seeing and responding to. So I just kind of wanted to set that up as a longer trend over the past few years, and compare that to where we are now and what we're seeing now.
Yeah, Carl, I want to get your impressions from the other coast. Tell us a little bit about what you're seeing on the ground in Oakland. How are residents feeling? What have they experienced? And how long has the problem been going on?
Well, first of all, again, I am so excited to be invited, for this, along with many of our wonderful panelists. First of all, let's go back to in Oakland. And basically, it didn't happen only in Oakland. It's basically happening all over this country. Like Ravi was saying, that in New York, but many places also been experiencing this attacks against Asian Americans and Asian community. So all this has been happening, but city of Oakland became the epicenter, talking about this issue, and it was starting with so-called local news, and it turned into national attention, and then also we are garnishing and getting all this international attention as well. So almost all these reporters are coming to Oakland and talk about the issue. Now let's go back to the beginning of this so-called attacks in the Asian community and Asian Americans. It didn't start yesterday. It started many years ago. And the reason why people are not aware of it, because people just not getting all this information, or even numbers being reported. I know Ravi talk about numbers, and I just want you to know that there's so many unreported incidents, and even based on the Stop AAPI Hate, there are certain numbers being reported. But what we have learned is that almost under less than 20% of these incidents being reported. So people ask me, and how are the people feeling at this time? Number one, many of them, they feel very scared. They feel very sad, and some feel anger. But when all this has been happening and things are being done, many people they have high hope. They are being hopeful and hoping that things will be done. And again, despite of this crime happening against the Asian API community, the sad part is that most of them are targeting our seniors, and we find that there's so many seniors. They feel very unsafe walking down their own streets. So at this time, there's so many people are being impacted directly. Now let's talk about Chinatown as another impacted area. In Chinatown, many of our businesses now, they have decided to close much earlier. And because some of these incidents happening during broad daylight, and almost like they couldn't see the end of it. So many employees also be afraid to coming to work. And there are many folks, they used to come to shop in Chinatown, but they are also afraid to come out. So those are the direct impacts to the API community. And it's happening again. It's not only in one specific area. It's happening in this entire country. So, I think what we need to do at this point is to, number one, to bring in the attention. And we're also understanding that these are the major problem. But I think we cannot always focusing on the problems. We should be focusing more on the solutions, what we can do to stop this kind of attacks. And I also want to address another issue, which is so important. Now, we've been talking about hate crime and attacks, with hate involved. However, to prove that that's hate crime, when we've been talking with the district attorney officers, they're saying that they believe that's hate crime, but it has to be proved proven that that's hate crime. So far, we were, even though there's so many incidents have happened, there's still a major issue on how to prove that these crimes are called hate crimes. So with that, I think, just to let you know, we are so thankful that there's so many people besides our own community. Many of you are here to support us. And so that's the reason why earlier I said we're hopeful, because, we're not only focusing on the problems. I think at this time we're also focusing on the possible solutions to stop this hate crime against the API community.
Thank you for that, and thank you to both you and Ravi and to Wesley for joining us. Wesley, I want to go to you and talk a little bit more about, I guess, causality. What's been driving, I think, what seems like a recent surge over the past couple of months. I wonder if you have thoughts on if there are particular causes, particular reasons that we've seen a resurgence in anti-Asian bias crime in the past, or anti-Asian crimes targeting Asians in the past several months.
Well, I mean, this is kind of a tricky question, right? Because Carl mentioned that it's not new. It's been going on for a long time. A quick Google search will, bring up stories from 2012 talking about, there's a headline that I looked at in, I think it was the Bay Guardian, that sort of noted that there is this dirty secret within the Bay Area of Black on Asian crime. And so starting, I guess in September, or it may have even been earlier, of 2020, you started to see these videos. They went viral of people attacking Asian people, and almost without exception, these were Black assailants. And, the data says that hate crime, that Black people are disproportionate in the number of hate crimes they commit. And somebody who takes a very sort of social justice oriented vision of the world ought to understand why this would be so, because in a structurally racist or a systemically racist world, right, that is sort of designed and architected against people of color, one does not have to commit crimes of hate crimes on the street, right? And so it follows from that logic that that there would be more people who were at the bottom of this hierarchy who would be full of hate and who would be attacking people, right, on the streets. So Black people are something like 1.6 or close to being, sort of twice the percentage of those of all people who commit hate crimes. They are sort of 15% of the population. They're like 26% of those who commit hate crimes. And that's a fact that's very difficult for the progressive mind to take into account, because sort of their theory of the case of the hate crime is that we sort of live in a white supremacist society, right? And that only white people oppress non-white people in that society, and sort of within the activist community that sort of that is behind the theory of the white of the hate crime, and that sort of uses it to such powerful effect to expand its clout and its funding, and so forth. It cannot be the case. It is very difficult for them to deal with the fact that we have one non-white group attacking another non-white group, right? That doesn't fit with their understanding. And so the question as we moved out of the Trump years was the sort of campaign against white supremacy and the constant invocation of it as the hyper object that explains everything negative about this country was going to be tested, because we were moving away, because that was a feature of the Trump years. And we moved away from that. Trump is no longer in office. The president is now Joe Biden. The vice president is now Kamala Harris, a former prosecutor in San Francisco. And the president is the man who was chiefly responsible in the Senate of the passage of the crime bill of 1994 that is now widely seen as being responsible for mass incarceration, which is now retroactively seen as a kind of racist white supremacist policy. So what was going to happen to that meme? What was going to happen to that hyperobject? What was going to happen to that blanket explanation of everything bad that happens in the country? And when it turned out to be the case that one of the sort of hate crime problems that we were dealing with was attacks on one non-white group by another non-white group, or assailants who happen to be from one non-white group against another non-white group. What would happen as a result, and what did in fact happen for a couple of weeks as this came into view, was that there was lots of use of the passive, passive tense in various passive constructions of sentences, and a rigorous sort of excision, right, of the race of the assailant in any of these discussions. And then eventually, of course, the white perpetrator then emerged in Atlanta, and that was folded into the narrative, and everyone who had been systematically evading or lying about the race of the assailants could then emerge and be vindicated, right, in their say, well, this is about white supremacy, this proves it, this shows what this was all about all along. It goes back to Trump. It goes back to the fact that Trump spoke of the China virus. And of course, that was non-normative behavior by a president. It was wrong for him to use that term. But it's not as if violent bigots cannot come to their own conclusions on the basis of the fact that the disease did originate from China. Like, Trump is certainly a factor in the changing of that atmosphere, but the news itself, right, is in my view almost certainly the larger factor in this. Now, to the question of the rise, right? There are no uniform standards about what constitutes a hate crime. There are perennial attacks that we see that are a feature of our cities, where people who are targets of opportunity end up being targeted by criminals. And what makes them targets of opportunity? Not just the fact that they're different, but the fact that, like, they don't necessarily speak the same language, they don't have strong relationships with the police, they're not going to call the police. There was just a controversy over at YouTube where some staff wanted them to stop the circulation of a video that was controversial a few years ago by the rapper YG, who sort of, he rapped about the fact that, like, Asian Americans hoard cash in their homes, and therefore, they're targets of opportunity for robbery. And sort of, YouTube decided against the suppression of that video, though some of their employees were demanding it. But that video was sort of giving voice to the experiences of YG when he was a young gangster, right? Like, people knew this was part of the lore of the people who were involved in that kind of activity, that, like, Asians were, now, does that make attacks on them? We're targets of opportunity because they hoard cash, right? Whether that's true or not, right? Now, does that make them victims of hate crimes when they are robbed or when they're assaulted or when they're attacked? Like, what makes it a hate crime or not? So I think there is a serious question about whether the increase from 3 hate crimes in 2019 to 28 hate crimes in 2020 is more a function of the application of different standards, and if this is something, or the application by individual officers of not different standards, but, like, applying those standards on the way they report and think, because there's increased salience about this fact. Are we seeing something that is actually an increase, or are we seeing the revelation of a perennial problem that is a factor of those, certain urban environments where this kind of thing has always happened? They're being recorded more as hate crimes. There's more awareness of it because of the viral videos that are traveling. There's more willingness to come forward and report them on those who are victims and who in the past would not. Like, I don't think we have clear answers to this. I don't know how we could get clear answers to this. As a whole, I'm kind of skeptical. I think that to the extent that there may have been an increase, I think it's probably consistent with other increases that we've seen. And of course, what we've seen is some crimes have gone down and other crimes have gone up. So, like, robbery and home invasion are up, but, like, sexual assault is down by quite a bit. And what we're seeing is, like, a redistribution of crime. And then we're also seeing certain policies about, like, sort of no bail and so on and so forth, that is putting more criminally minded people back onto the street. And in some of these cases, there's it's still anecdotal. It can only be anecdotal when we're talking about a data set that goes from 3 to 28. That's not a lot of crime, actually, right? And, like, it's actually true that Asian Americans are the group, they remain the group that are least likely to either commit a crime or to be the victim of a crime in this country. So like all of those things have to like be put into context. Nonetheless, there are these like horrible things that are being captured on videos. These frightening things are happening. They seem to be happening in larger numbers, but I don't really know to what extent we're talking about like a huge upsurge.
Yeah, so I want to build off of that and something Carl said. First, to go to Ravi. There has been some debate about sort of how we think about, and Carl says he's facing this with district attorney, how we think about what is a hate crime, what isn't a hate crime. So can you talk to us about how law enforcement thinks about identifying hate crimes, and especially somebody said, I forget who, it's much easier to identify an anti-Semitic hate crime. Somebody carves a swastika on a synagogue, that's probably an anti-Semitic hate crime. It's harder to identify anti-Asian hate crimes. There are fewer obvious cues. So how does law enforcement think about parceling out hate crimes and what makes them different from regular non-hate crimes?
Sure. So first of all, both my co-panelists, I think, brought up excellent points, particularly when we talk about underreporting, which is something the NYPD is absolutely concerned about. We think that is a real problem. And the question about, the rise that we're seeing, how much of a function of that is actual an increase in incidents and how much is explained by more willingness to report is something that I think needs some examination. But to talk to the point about hate crimes, Wesley brings up some really good questions about here, right? The standards of what defines a hate crime is going to vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. Most of these hate crimes are going to be prosecuted locally. So what you're looking at in California is not going to be the same as what you're looking at in New York. There are federal hate crime statutes, but you need to get to some level of jurisdiction in order for to take it federally. So that doesn't often happen. A lot of these things, like I said, are being handled locally. So I can talk to the New York specific experience as an example, right? So New York, like many other hate crimes legislations, specify essentially the types of categories or identities that are protected by hate crime statutes, right? So these are probably intuitive to most people by now. We're talking about perception, not necessarily actual, the perception of race, color, national origin, gender, sexual orientation, disability at times. And, there's some different, permutations to that depending on the laws that you're talking about. The way that New York State approaches it is it uses hate crimes as an enhancement, right? So it's not like you're going to charge somebody with something that is called a hate crime. What you're going to do is you're going to charge them with the underlying crime, whether it's a homicide or an assault. And if you can show that it is a hate crime, then you'll get an enhancement in sentencing. Now, the question is, well, how do you show something is a hate crime? Which is, I think, the question that Wesley was bringing up. And that's the difficulty. Even, Carl was getting to this as well, where, when you're talking to a prosecutor, what the law demands and, what public pressure may ask for don't always line up, right? And so what the law is looking for is some kind of ambiguity, that the attack was carried out specifically because the perpetrator perceived the victim to belong to one of these identities or one of these classes. It has to be either exclusively or substantially motivated by that perception. And so that is what the investigation focuses on, right? It's talking to witnesses, it's talking to the victim, it's reviewing video footage, it's reaching out to the community to see what they know about a particular purpose, looking at a purpose, criminal history. It's getting all of that stuff together to figure out whether or not there's essentially, beyond a reasonable doubt, an indication that this person targeted the victim specifically because they perceived them as belonging to one of these classes. And it's a pretty high standard in law. And I think, a lot of the frustration that we tend to hear is that, what the public perception is, particularly after an attack like we saw in Atlanta, that public perception, that public demand doesn't always line up with what the law allows. And so to Wesley's point about, kind of hate crimes and, are they being redistributed? One of the things that we saw in 2020 is generally a decrease in hate crimes across the board, right? So if you assume that in New York City, you're controlling for jurisdictional issues, right? You're looking at, New York state law, you're generally talking about the New York City Police Department. What we see is a general decrease in hate crimes across the board, but we do see the one anomaly there is the increase in anti-Asian hate crimes. And I think that's worth pointing out.
Carl, I want to ask you to respond a little bit to Wes's point about the perenniality of this issue. You live in one of the oldest, predominantly Chinese American communities in the United States, a sort of one of the larger ones too, I think, all that confined demographic information. How, you alluded to this has been a long-standing problem. Tell me more about that.
So I think Ravi did a great job articulating, what has been happening about, these crimes, and especially, targeting Asian community. And also, I'm so excited to see that, we are in this topic now. When we have been seeing this toxic rhetoric, to demonize the API Americans and API community, there's so many people being hurt, and especially our seniors. Now, many of us are still, being troubled by this so-called pandemics. But the API community, we are experiencing two pandemics simultaneously, okay? And not only because of health issue, but now that the attacks is real. Now let's going back to some of the issues and problems we're talking about, numbers of incidents happening in this country. I want people to understand the crime and all these incidents happening, and I mentioned earlier, they're way underreporting. Now, I remember when I started working on this, the spike actually started in January 2012 in our community. So what had happened was that, when pandemic hit, because of this rhetoric, all talking about like China virus and all the other things that, all targeting Asian community. So there were many incidents. I myself and the victims of crime, they came to us and talked to me, and we brought them over to the district attorney, Alameda County district attorney, and we're trying to do something about it. And you know what happened? Just because, some of the seniors wearing masks at the beginning of the pandemic last year in January, and people just walking down the street, being, API, and, they are being, many of them, they were abused verbally, and many physically. They got punched in the face just because they're wearing the face mask. They didn't do anything wrong. Now, when we got this attention to the district attorney, so what they have done, they set up a special unit, and also doing the public, announcement, and they also translating into Asian languages, and so people can call in to report crimes. And you know what happened? Many people called me. They also called the district attorney's office. They will tell them what had happened. And then, at the end, they say, I'm so happy that you're reporting this. Can I write down your name and all the basic information? And guess what? They hang up. And many people are saying that I'm not willing to report. So we were able to ask the questions, why? And the first response is that I'm so afraid of the retaliation. That's the reason why they don't want to report it. Okay, and they don't want to be identified. So the numbers of incidents happening is way, way higher than that we are aware of. Now, I also want to talk about eventually the robbery cases will be down. Not because they're down, because we have like lawmakers, and they're coming up with some new legislative, like the one that we just been talking about yesterday, called SB 82. And what they are trying to do, they're saying that robberies without weapons, as long as the victims are not seriously hurt. Remember, seriously hurt. Okay. Now let me give one example. Some of you may have seen that gentleman. He was sitting inside the laundromat. Okay. So 3 suspects came in and put him upside down, robbing him up. If this SB 82 were passed, and that would become a petty theft. So the numbers and the incidents, if we keep downplaying all these incidents and saying that they are just petty theft, and when I ask the district attorney officers and the prosecutors, they're saying that normally when it downgrading from a robbery to petty theft, they may not even take those cases. So we are getting to the numbers into a minor infraction. So basically, they are not serious crime, even though they are. Now, again, I know Barry said it so clearly and pointing that out. You have to prove that is a hate crime. But currently, there are so many incidents we believe and we know that's hate crime, but unfortunately, they are not being prosecuted as hate crimes because that person committing this incident, they didn't say, I hate you, Asian. They didn't say that. So it's so difficult to prove that. But again, we know there are so many incidents happening. So, but we are here to talk about, again, now we're focusing on these problems. But later on, I think we should talk more about on the solution part.
Yeah, no, absolutely, I agree with that, and I want to get to that in just a couple of minutes. I do want to talk a little bit about the crime element that Carl just brought up. As Ravi said earlier, in New York City, and this is true, we more or less indicated from FBI data, true more or less nationwide, there's a decline in property crimes, a decline in certain categories of violent crimes, an increase in homicide, shootings, and some other categories of violent crimes across 2020 by comparison to 2019. And this is really a question for all of the panelists. People should feel free to offer their opinions, but what is the role that the sort of level of violent crime in general is playing in these incidents? Is it unrelated? Is it a significant factor? How should we be thinking about that?
So let me hop in real quick.
Absolutely.
So it actually gets to one of the points I wanted to make in the first round, but I didn't get a chance to. But when we were talking about, say, the rise in crime in New York City in 2020 in specific categories, right? We were talking about homicides and we're talking about shootings, and I think there's been a lot of media coverage on this over the course of the last year, and that's absolutely right. I think it was a 97% year-over-year increase from 2019 to 2020. We're talking about shootings, and I forget the exact percentages of homicides, but
it's 40, just under 45 in New York City. Yeah.
But what we don't see is that the crimes that are being directed at Asian Americans fitting into those categories, right? So it's not that they are being murdered in the streets and in those numbers, right? The crimes we typically see being directed against Asian Americans are assaults, they're harassment. It's somebody being punched, somebody being pushed, somebody being stomped on, as we saw in that video. But when we look at the overall crime trends, like those types of crimes across the city have decreased. And when we see these kind of incidents targeting the Asian American community, it's not just, I don't think it's as easily explainable to be like, oh, this is just an increase in crime writ large, because the incidents of crime that we're seeing are not matching up with the type of crime that's being committed in large part against Asian Americans in these hate crimes.
Wesley, do you have thoughts on that, and in response to the general crime trends that you alluded to also in your first answer?
Yeah, I mean, he's describing a pattern where people are assholes to Asians, and they push them around and harass them, and they do that because there's this giant pandemic, and a handful of bigots out there are taking it out on targets of opportunity that they know don't want to put themselves through the legal process, just as Carl described. And so it's really a kind of public safety issue. And if you want to create deterrent power, there's a couple of ways to do it. One of them is self-defense. Another way is persuading people to begin to trust police and prosecutors to protect them and to put themselves through that process. And it's tricky to do that at the same moment when you're also proposing within the legislature, right, to a group of small business owners, right, to a community that has a lot of small business owners who are menaced by this, to make any crime under $1,000, which is a lot to a small business owner, that doesn't involve serious injuries, into a petty crime that in many cases won't be investigated or won't be prosecuted at all, but will expose your identity on a piece of paper as an accuser, right? So like to do both of those things at the same time and then have a rally about like stop Asian hate, fight white supremacy, while you're also right, like taking this measure that will be that materially makes it harder to build bonds of trust between people who are being victimized, and create any kind of legal deterrent effect. Those things work at cross purposes for one another, and that's a real problem. So it's not just that works at cross purposes. Other forms of sort of ending cash bail and so on. And of course, I'm not saying we shouldn't be experimenting in less punitive forms of criminal justice and so forth, or that there isn't some validity to the critique of cash bail as an unfair imposition on certain communities versus others. Like, we have to talk about these things, but we also have to like think about and hold in balance what that actually means in practice. And what it means in practice is that, like, there will be more people walking the street whom we know are violent criminals, and some of them will be jerks to Asians they encounter on the subway, and that's going to get caught on video, and some of that is going to go viral. So all of these things are going to build on one another, and we have a crisis. I think it's mostly connected to elements in the news and parts of society that are affected by them, and that will act on them. A lot of like mentally ill people, right? Like, for the most part, are going to like just take things that are in the environment and lash out at people on the basis of it. I think that's not a small part of this kind of thing.
Yeah, I want to take a quick question from the audience, which I'm going to kick to Ravi, and then I want to talk a little bit about solutions, as Carl's brought up, which I think is the most important question here. Ravi, somebody asks, what similarities are there between the attacks on the Hasidim in Brooklyn and Monsey 2 years ago and the anti-Asian attacks today? Can you shed any light on that?
Well, sure. I mean, I think when we're talking about hate crimes, and this is kind of inherent to hate crimes, in that we basically are seeing a broad swath of criminality targeting these communities, right? So the highest profile, when we're talking about Monsey, this was an attack back, I think, in 2019, outside of just in a suburb of New York City. And, that came shortly after there was an attack on a kosher supermarket in Jersey City, right across the river from Manhattan, right? So that was the kind of environment that we were in then. And those were kind of the high profile attacks that really kind of punctuated the rise in anti-Semitic attacks going on in the city during that time. And in some ways, the attack in Atlanta is kind of doing the same for the anti-Asian hate crime spike this year. But those tend to be the generally higher profile attacks. But what we are seeing, and the majority of these attacks aren't high profile in that way. They are, what Wesley was describing, just everyday, harassment. It is vandalism of houses of worship, for example, or it's graffiti. And, you talked about this point about there being kind of visual identifiers for anti-Semitism that don't exist necessarily for anti-Asian hate. But that's not to say that harassment and lower level crimes aren't also being committed, targeting Asian communities that kind of fall below the radar because they're not high profile or there's not a video about them. So the similarities are essentially that we're seeing kind of a pretty wide range. Hate takes a variety of forms, and I think we see that to be true regardless of the community that's being targeted.
Sure, absolutely. So I want to sort of move us into talking about how we can respond. I actually want to start with you, Carl. Can you tell me just a little bit about how the city of Oakland has been responding to these issues, and what have they done that has been positive, and what have they done? What would you like to see more of?
Okay, I think when we are studying our city, of city government, and actually will give us a better picture of the national entire country, how we're dealing with issues like this. Now, when all this happening, one thing I have to say, the city has to learn from us, the community. When things happen, we come together. We're trying to find solutions and doing things. If you ask me how our city is responding, I think they all have the best intention, all the elected officials. But guess what? They are doing things so differently. So we are seeing more conflict within the city itself. And then, we have more fights Now, I still recall, and I'm sorry, I have to, remind everybody. I know that they're not happy for me to talk about this. When we had our first conference, our press conference, and of course, I invited the elected officials. So instead of talking about, I did talk about the issues, but during the press conference, there was a major fight. I know many of you were aware of it, and that's the reason why we got this national attention again. So what we are seeing that there is a division, not only within the city, in a county, in a state, in a federal government, and because of this division, and that's the reason why we're hearing and seeing so much on this rhetoric. At the very beginning, I'm sure a few years ago, the target was actually the Middle Eastern countries, and then later on it became the Mexican, and now that it's all Asian. So this is not all. This is all expected because that's how the division came about, and which is hurting us now. And I also want to address one thing, because how we are addressing this issue. We actually had many people, many media attention, and depending on their focus, because when we're trying to focusing on the problems and the solutions, and some of them are actually focusing on the racial tension. So now that we are not only dealing with the API attacks and all these issues happening, we're also dealing with a conflict. I have to be saying this seriously. There is also creating a conflict between the African American community and also Asian community. But the real issue is not there. Unfortunately, there's some national attention. They're turning the focus. So we want to refocus us back into the real issues and finding solutions. And I know your questions to me, what's the city's responding? Actually, right now, after all these incidents happening, we were at the end, at this point, we were able to work with our city leadership. And now that also working with the police department, we're able to bring in what we call a Asian liaison officer, serving the Chinatown community, someone who could speak the language and they can trust, so that there were many people can get help. So hopefully many people are willing to come out to report incidents and bringing more confidence, people back into our community. But again, I want to also focusing on the short-term and long-term solution. At this time, we are with the city, along with the community, we are having our own patrol in Chinatown, and which is within our own community. These are the residents, the seniors, the employees, and volunteers and business owners come together. We have over 100 volunteers now working Chinatown, and we're also giving out the air horns and the safety alerts. In fact, the safety alerts are actually donating from New York City, so that we are able to pass them on to the seniors and the group called Safe from Hate. So they're donating to us, and the air horns work effectively. And we are also giving seminars and giving safety tips to people they want to learn. But of course, we are also receiving additional police resources from the Oakland Police Department, also from the Alameda County Sheriff Department. Now, remember, these are only short-term solution. The long-term solution is how are we going to stop all this hate crime against not only the Asian community, but all communities. I think we've got to bring people together, and hate is the topic. We cannot just, just saying that we're realizing it, but what are we going to do about it? Okay, so let's start from the ground zero. So hate, did not come about, when we were born as a kid. We were educated, influenced by the family, by school, by the social media, and workplace, and especially from our elected officials, politicians. Because, normally we're being divided so that they can so-called, I am serving my constituents. Remember, this is not, we are not divided. So I think it's important for us to understand we need to work together. We need to, again, start from education. We got to educate our kids from young, from school, from home, from the community, from the social media, and especially, we're watching the news, watching all these programs. Anything that we are learning, let's educate ourselves so that we understand to embrace that diversity, embrace different cultures. So this is important. Now, we cannot be divided, because this is the country we call United States of America, united. So I think we have to start working on educating us. the education on love and unity. So words matter. So let's try to stay away from all these negative words, hate and also division. So if we are willing to start from ourselves on to influence the others, I think that would be much of a long-term solution to stop hate. And definitely, I think there would be cutting down much crimes against not only the API community. It will cut down so much crime across the border.
Mm-hmm. I want to ask Wesley to sort of respond to that last point, because I think there's been a lot of, there really are two levels of response. There's the short-term response, which is like, how can we reduce crime right now, and then the long-term cultural response, which is, what are the cultural factors that determine ebbing and flowing bias crime? What are the cultural factors that determine enmity that can turn into an offense? And there's been a great deal of emphasis on the latter, I think, in the national discourse on how we can reshape culture. So I'm sort of interested, Wesley, if you have thoughts on how you can reshape culture, what that actually looks like concretely. How can you get how if at all possible do you think about reducing levels of bias? How do you think about changing how people think about other people, for lack of a better phrase?
Well, so there's this paradox in hate crimes legislation where it's presented as the sort of commitment of the community on behalf of the safety of its residents, and creates a set of protected classes that it sort of affirms as a form of kind of sort of democratic tribute, right, to their belonging within the community. But sort of any amount of hate crime is then sort of presented as a picture of a country sort of riven by violence and interracial factionalism. So that the first year these laws were put into effect, when in fact, of course, a criminal is by definition a person who flouts the wishes of society, right? So how can the actions of a criminal be seen as expressive of the hate and hate that is endemic within that society? And yet that kind of reversal inevitably always happens. It feeds a narrative, right? And they exist primarily in order to feed that narrative. The first year, many of these crimes were being measured, and it's very recent that we even have this concept of a hate crime being legislated into law. Back in 1991, 92, the first year we had figures for this. All the reporting said, well, there's been an increase, right? Well, it's just not possible for there to be an increase when they've never been measured before, right? And so what is the actual baseline level of deviant criminals who hate others and commit violence against them, in a society of 350 million? When you look at New York City, we're talking about a nearly tenfold increase, but that increases from 3 to 28, right? Like in a city of millions, right? And so, on a statistical basis, are we in fact talking about a reign of terror? Now, it's true, Carl is saying, for every one of these attacks, there are many other attacks that are not being reported, and I take that to be correct. But what's the baseline, right, for living in a diverse class, race, economically stratified city like New York, for people to be assholes, right? Like are we actually in a crisis? And I think if you listen to the answers, it's really kind of hard to know, right? And whether or not we perceive it as such is largely a matter of how the media portrays it and how various interest groups that derive their clout from having there be a sense of crisis. And sometimes that sense of crisis can be used for salutary means, such as like moving the police department to sort of create a liaison, create a team, put undercover officers out there to deal with the crime. This is the kind of crime that can be deterred, right? Like daytime attack, brazen daytime assaults on people within a confined area and certain groups of people. Like those are the kind of crimes that can be defeated through policing more than almost any other kind of crime, right? And so like, I see it as a public safety issue. I see it as a public safety issue that, to the extent that like police departments work with communities to like persuade people to report crimes, to follow through on the prosecution process because they can make a credible commitment to them that they're going to keep them safe, right? I see it as like an eminently solvable issue in the short term. In the long term, it's like, well, you know, we're pretty diverse and tolerant society, right? Like most people walk around without like undue fear, and to the extent that they have fear, a lot of that fear is being created by this sense of crisis. Can we do better? Sure, there's probably things that we can do better, but we're never going to be in a society without crime. We're never going to be a society without policing. We're never going to be a society without prisons. And there are many people who are indulging fantasies that were about all of the above that end up, for the reason I referred to before, this kind of movement to like make robbery, not just theft, like forcing somebody to give you money in a one-on-one confrontation where you're threatening them with violence, maybe not with a gun or a knife, but with some form of violence, right? A petty theft, right? Like that is something that is connected to this broader public project of like thinking that we're gonna, you know, arrive at some point of perfect justice where we're not going to need police, and we're not going to, you know, and that we should, and ultimately it works at cross purposes to the previous thing that I was talking about, right? And so any kind of solution that proceeds from the premise that like first we're going to like remove all injustice from the world, and then we'll have no more problems, is like, and then we're just going to go ahead with that, like that piece of reform now in the present, right? Like before we've solved other problems and injustices, like is definitely not going to get us there. So
I want to, with our remaining time, focus a little more on the specifics with Ravi. Can you talk about how law enforcement and the NYPD in particular are thinking about their role in responding to this, and to bring in something from our viewers? In several of these incidents, a number of these incidents actually, the offender has been severely mentally ill. The case on Monday, the shooting in Atlanta. How does the NYPD think about responding, particularly in those situations, but also more generally the role of policing in combating hate crime and extremism?
Yeah, so really easy questions. I can wrap this up in 10 seconds. All right. So the first part is, you know, about solutions. What is the NYPD doing to respond? And you know, it comes down essentially to community engagement. You know, we said we were concerned about underreporting in some of these categories of crimes. We want to make sure, to Carl's point, that we're creating a level of comfort between the community and the police department, such that they're able to come forward and feel more comfortable coming forward to report these kinds of things, so we can get a better sense of the baseline, to Wesley's point, right? One of the ways we're doing that, you know, so last year we stood up specifically an Asian hate crimes task force, which is kind of separate from our general hate crimes task force, and it's specifically staffed with 24 detectives speaking about 12 East and Southeast Asian languages. You know, we're holding more events in our Asian-heavy neighborhoods, right? So that's like Flushing in Queens, it's Sunset Park in Brooklyn, it's Chinatown in the city, and ensuring that we've got the linguistic support, to Carl's point, there where we can actually communicate in native language with potential victims or with witnesses to see what's going on. We also have you know, a number of patrols, like Carl had described, that are kind of community generated, and to be able to support that and to be able to link up with them, so that, you know, if they do see something, they know who to say something to, is something that we're also prioritizing. And you know, we're working with our prosecutors. We've got quite a number of prosecutors to work with in this city, each borough having its own DA, for example, but working with them to make sure that we are standardizing a bit about what it is that we are seeing, or having those conversations, to Wesley's point earlier about, you know, kind of discrepancies in how, in the definition of hate crimes and what that looks like. But that community engagement piece is super important. And I think it's also super important in the long term to think about making sure that the police department itself is reflective of the community, and so we're pretty close to that metric. I think the police department is about 9 or 10% Asian identified. I think the city itself is about 13, 14%. So maybe there's a little bit of a gap there that we can grow into. But that's important because we need those language skills. We need those we need to be not only linguistically, but culturally fluent in engaging with the communities that may be victimized so that they're comfortable to make that approach. And to answer the second part of that question about, just terrorism versus, kind of hate crimes, I mean, ultimately, when we talk about, terrorism and extremism and hate crimes, they both kind of pull from the same kind of, societal prerogative that Wesley had laid out, right? Which is this idea to say that there exists this class of crime that is meant to target or tear at, what we think is our societal fabric or societal functioning. And that those class of crimes need to have more severe sanction in our criminal justice system, right? You can agree with that, you can disagree with that, but there are, people across the political spectrum that fall on both sides of that argument. But the way that we're thinking about, terrorism is to think about it in a standpoint, and this has generally been true since 9/11, of prevention in a way that we are looking for, the possibility of, kind of spectacular violence or plots that are looking to cause death or serious bodily injury, and to prevent those attacks from happening at the first instance, where traditionally hate crimes, we are investigating once those crimes happen. And there's a number of reasons for that. I think generally speaking, when we're looking at hate crimes, they tend to be more opportunistic. You don't have these kind of longer timelines that you would do in the terrorism world, where you have the opportunity to interdict. One of the co-panelists, I think it was Wesley, said that, essentially these are people that are taking advantage of an opportunity to strike out and then are charged with a hate crime enhancement. We're able to show that. In the extremism world, in the terrorism world, to get back to the point we were talking about earlier, there we are seeing a little bit of, concerning rhetoric coming out of, the COVID crisis on like the white supremacist front, right? And I don't want to, say that doesn't exist. We saw propaganda coming out of some of these groups about targeting Asians specifically because they were spreading the virus, right? So that continues to be a concern for us. So it's not an either-or scenario. But I think the takeaway here is that regardless of whether or not we're talking about hate in the manifestation of a hate crime in the legal term, or hate in a manifestation of terrorism in the legal term, we have an apparatus to deal with that. And that's something we're going to continue to do with the resources that we have at our disposal.
Okay, great. Thank you so much to our panelists for such an insightful and timely discussion. I appreciate everyone making the time to be here today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I think no, I'm still live. There we go. And thank you all of our viewers for tuning into our event this afternoon. Before we close, I'd like to invite our public audience to sign up to receive updates from the Policing and Public Safety Initiative, including our new newsletter and information on our upcoming events using the link in the chat. And keep your eyes out for our next Policing and Public Safety Initiative event, fireside chat, on April 7th. Where we're speaking with several experts on the progressive prosecutor movement and how local law enforcement officials are responding to it. Also upcoming from the Manhattan Institute in May, we'll be hosting an event with Manhattan Institute Senior Fellow Glenn Lowry and Barry Weiss on the intersection of anti-Semitism and anti-racism. So I encourage you to keep an eye out for that as well. I think all the links should be in the chat. On our website, you can also browse the Manhattan Institute's research. If you are able, please also consider supporting the Institute at the link you see in the chat. MI is a nonprofit organization, and our work depends on support from people like you. Thank you all so much for joining us today.